Now, on historyradio.org, Michael Henrik Wynn reads his short story, The Lion and the Hyena.
A story set in 1980s Nigeria.
Nigeria, a country you can truly call your own.
The Lion and the Hyena by Michael Henrik Wynn. Muhammad lay quiet in the corner of his cell when Police Chief Chirungu and his deputy passed by. They stopped by the door and smiled at his bruises. After all, Muhammad was a Muslim, and what they in turn referred to as a B citizen in the station. A B citizen was a person who had been arrested, but for whom they had yet to come up with a charge. Usually this was done within a few months, but it was not easy because Chirungu had limited imagination. Sometimes he claimed that they had attacked the police unprovoked, but most of the time he claimed that they were fundamentalists. This was very inconvenient because it was both very serious, there were bombing elsewhere in the country quite often, and most importantly it was impossible to disprove. After all, not even the judges had access to the man's mind. And most of his criminals were so starved, unclean and agitated when they arrived in court that the judge, who was a neat, well-kept and well-fed academic educated somewhere in Europe, frowned with disgust when they took the stand. Chirungu always smiled at this. Once, however, the judge had sent him a suspicious and irritated look, and after that Chirungu always wore his fake Ray-Ban glasses in court and pulled his cap a little down. Muhammad was one of those ruffians who became so cocky in their teens that they stood on street corners laughing at the police. Then, of course, he had no choice but to put him in his place. He got some of his men to pick him up one evening while he was out drinking and gave him a real good beating and dumped him in a cell overnight. When he woke in the morning, Muhammad was thirsty and bruised. They let him go with a warning. However, next week he looked at them with even more spite, and it was then that Chirungu decided that Muhammad was a B citizen. This was some years back. Of course, the local shop owners would be ordered to be very rude to Muhammad, and he would not be allowed to visit certain areas in which there were girls or entertainment. Chirungu also made sure that the taxi company in which Muhammad worked cut his salary, and that his girlfriend did not offer him sex more than once a month. This was the ultimate insult to any African man, and Chirungu thought that Muhammad would beat her senseless. But he did nothing, which was even more contemptible. There were many things that a B citizen would not be allowed to do. Chirungu and his deputy used to sit and brainstorm in order to come up with ways of limiting their options. Some suggested that they would deny them chicken or even bushmeat, leaving only pork. But this was very impractical. There was no way to keep track of such things. So he simply dismissed the idea. Even if Chirungu was feared by ordinary people, he was not disliked by his own, that is, the other police. He was a tall, muscular man with a round face, bold and black as coal. He had teeth, by contrast, which glittered like ivory when the roar of his laughter was heard. He had 6 children and a very proud wife, who was sometimes seen in the town square in a flowery robe, negotiating for the price of vegetables. She was not the sort of person who downplayed her position. She looked at you with determination, and she ordered her children about like a true deputy. And she obeyed her husband in everything. For after all, he was the police chief known locally as the Lion of Edo State. Chirungu almost never beat his wife. He was a man who appreciated loyalty, and she was loyal in every sense of the word. But if any shopkeeper was late with their payments, he had no qualms about bringing them in, then locking himself in his cell with the unfortunate late payer, who afterwards almost never repeated the offence. Muhammad had never been a major concern for Chirungu. He was a Muslim, but one of those nameless characters who sometimes drifted into town from the large shanty suburb north of the centre. He lived there with his ailing mother and his younger sister. Little is known about his mother's past. No one in such places had any identification. Those in the centre at least had a local idea. Very few, except for academics like the judge and people like himself and the rich tycoons, owned a passport. Chivungu had never used his passport. It just lay on his office shelf next to his golden bracelets, his sunglasses and the keys to his car. Muhammad's mother was fat and frail and quiet. She married another Muslim and they settled in a very modest house in town and she had her babies. Then suddenly the man left her. Some say they argued and some say he had found another woman. But Chivungu suspected that he had gone off to join the militants in the jungle. It did not matter because this was ages ago, and all these years Muhammad's mother had scraped by in a run-down shed with her 2 children. The house she had once lived in had been renovated and extended and now belonged to Chivungu's preacher. There was no bitterness on Chivungu's part against Muhammad and his family, but Chivungu needed to be respected and feared. If teenagers and 20 years olds were allowed to look him directly in the eye, that would not be possible. When Chivungu drove through the gravel-covered streets at night, they appeared in his headlights, dancing in front of women, showing off. When he heard music from portable radios, he often wondered why it was that he had never been this carefree himself. He had been destined for something else, for keeping control and for assuming power. He had always been a large man, and when he entered a room, all murmur had always fallen silent. Chivungu had really only begun thinking about Muhammad 2 years ago, when a young Muslim arrived from the north selling cheap Japanese Walkmans. Because he was a man from the other side, he ignored Chivungu's warning and struck up a friendship with Muhammad. They were both Muslims, but sometimes drank a little alcohol. Chivungu had begun pondering about how he could drive a wedge between the two, so that Muhammad would be kept in his place. After all, a beast citizen should never rise above his station. One day, while Chivungu was sitting in his office, he was notified of a car crash just north of town, involving 2 young men. At first he did not react. Nobody was seriously hurt, but the car had hit a tree and was now a total wreck. The officer had been paid on site, and Chivungu would receive his share, so the matter almost slipped by unnoticed. But upon his return to the station, the officer mentioned in passing that the men in the old blue Ford were Muhammad and his new friend. "Really?" said Chivungu. "I've had enough. It's time I had a talk with this electronics seller, whoever he might be. Bring him in. Let him understand that we don't like drunk driving in our town, living in a cell overnight. I will talk to him in the morning, alone." The next morning Chivungu entered the cell, and the following week the seller moved back north. The dry season had now arrived. The nights were cold, the stars clear, and the cracked ground quite as dusty in daylight. Muhammad was often seen in town, in back alleys, drinking cheap alcohol. He avoided those areas where he was not welcome and kept to himself. But he was not sober, and there were rumors that his aging mother was ill. When Muhammad was fired from his job, his sister took up whoring to pay for his mother's treatment. That made him feel even worse, for earning money was a man's duty in life, and what sort of man had he become? Then one day Chivungu was notified of a robbery. There was no one on call. They had been summoned to the scene of some exploded oil pipe. So Chivungu answered and drove to the crime scene himself. An old man was waiting for him. He showed visible signs of a beating and seemed very agitated. "Calm down, old man," Chivungu began. "Tell me what happened." Very slowly. "A young lunatic appeared out of nowhere, took all my money and fled." "Do you have any idea who he was?" "Yes, I know him well. It was that drunk Muhammad." "Muhammad? Are you sure?" Chivungu always smiled. "Yes, I know him well by sight." "I see. Don't worry. We will leave no stone unturned and find him. Get your money back. There's no need to search. He entered that shed over there. He's not come out." He pointed to a rotting wooden shed hidden in the shade of some trees a few 100 meters away. "How long ago?" "An hour, 2. Have you spoken to him?" "No, he's mad." Chivungu nodded. He left the old man and slowly and silently made his way towards the shed. There was no sound, only night crickets, but the flicker of a small light could be seen through the window, probably an oil lamp. Chivungu checked the back. There was only one entrance. He approached the door, stopped, and listened. All quiet. Then he tore the door open quickly and stuck his head in. The shed had been used for storage for old scrap metal, and rods and rusty bars were lying about among heaps of paper and plastic trash. In a clearing on the ground sat Muhammad, drunk as hell. He was alive, but only glanced up indifferently at Chungu. "You know what your problem is, Muhammad? You have no respect for authority. You never had. My mother died last night. I could not pay for her treatment." Their eyes met, and suddenly Chungu smiled and even laughed. He was a huge man, towering above the drunk Muhammad. "So now you finally realize that you cannot change the way things are in this world." Chungu went to the window and looked out to wave at the old man 200 meters away. As he turned, he heard a swish and felt a sharp pain in his ankles. The huge policeman tumbled over and fell to the ground with a thump. He was not unconscious and realized that Muhammad had swung at his legs with one of the rusty iron bars. It had been a tremendous blow, for Chungu felt blood on his hands. He looked up and saw the insane and frightened stare of Muhammad. In a flash, the madman had opened the door and fled into the dense, dark forest. It goes without saying that Muhammad never returned to his old town. He walked till morning, slept by a river, and started to make his way north. He thought maybe there would be a better life for him, somewhere where there had been more Muslims like himself. He stayed clear of major cities, ate bushmeat, drank water from creeks and wells, and consumed berries. In the open areas he hitchhiked with the lorry drivers and called himself Ali instead of Muhammad. When he eventually arrived at a mid-sized northern town, he first lived on the street. Then he got a job as a cleaner at a mosque, and he rented a room. It was only 11 square meters, but it was something. A year passed, and Muhammad had the feeling of a new beginning. He had no friends, but he never had anyway. One evening, after he had received his paycheck and was walking home, he took a shortcut via a long, poorly lit alley. He was halfway through the alley when a shadow rushed upon him out of nowhere. He felt a sting in his arm, and before he knew it, all his money had vanished. He had been robbed. Returning to the light of his room, he noticed a bad stab wound on his arm. There was blood and pain. At first he wanted to deal with it himself, but eventually he walked 4 kilometers under the crescent sky to the hospital. They cleaned and dressed the wound, put on some bandages, and then he sat waiting till morning in the corridor. At dawn, the nurses, the doctor, and finally a policeman arrived. The policeman was an elderly man, wise in the ways of the world. He told Ali not to worry. The culprit had already been caught. Unfortunately, he had brought alcohol for the entire amount. "Alcohol?" said Ali. "Yes," the old man replied. "He was one of those infidel Christian pigs." "I see." Even if these were cruel words, there was an immediate connection between the officer and the man now calling himself Ali. The old man bought Ali sweet tea, and then they smoked and talked for an hour. At one point the man said, "I hear you work in a mosque. That is noble work." "I'm only a cleaner, but still, it is something. I make an okay living as a policeman. The pay is not much, but it is steady, and there are extra sources of income. My children depend on these, you see." "Yes." "We're actually looking for new recruits. You need a few courses, but the state provides them one by one. You're spoon-fed." He smiled. "I'm not sure if this is my thing." Before the old man left, their eyes met again, and there was another moment of unspoken understanding. The next week, Ali did contact the recruiting office, and the story goes that he eventually did become a policeman, and some years later, even the police chief of a small town. There he became known for his violent temper, his cunning, and his ruthlessness. Because of the way he compensated for his feeble stature and utter lack of mercy, they called him the Hyena. They say he referred to all these Christian criminals as sea citizens.
You have just heard Michael Henrik Wynn reading his short story, The Lion and the Hyena. This is historyradio.org, a free radio stream promoting knowledge of literature and history.